There we go. Thank you. He is risen.
He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
Amen. Yes, indeed. This is a day of victory. A day when we celebrate our risen Lord. We celebrate our salvation. We celebrate the victory over death, the victory over sin that we have. And I want to tell you, I have been victorious my whole life. Grew up in the great state of Kentucky. We had UK basketball, winning championship after championship after championship. And we were good, man. We were really good. And the years we were bad, we were really, really bad. Grew up a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And so the 19, yeah, I know. So in the 1970s, you got your revenge in 93 or 94, whatever it was. So be quiet over there. Steelers won 4 championships, NFL championships in the 70s. They won another one in the 90s, won another one here a couple of years ago. They are tied with New England Patriots. We can boo on that one. For the most Super Bowl champions. So I grew up being a champion, being victorious. Cincinnati Red fan from the time I could walk. Loved Johnny Bench. He was the most incredible baseball player I've ever had witness to. And the Cincinnati Reds won world championships in the early 70s. Moved to Austin, Texas, and what happens? The Cedar Park Timberwolves win a state championship in football, of which my son was a part of. And we went to another one his senior year, then won another one the year after he graduated. So I'm a winner. I choose winners. Every team I pick is a winner. But I want you to understand that before I pick these teams, not so good. Not so good. So I am the solidifying effect on that. I'm the one that has pulled all these teams together. You know, I am. I'm a champion. I am victorious in everything I put my hands to. Married the greatest woman in the world. Amen. Got 3 great. I'll take anybody to task on that one. Okay, I did. And so did you. You married the greatest woman in the world too. And so did you, and so did everybody. But they weren't always champions. Pittsburgh Steelers were the poster child for futility from 1933 until 1968. And even in 1968, they couldn't get it right. They won the last game of the season and lost the first draft in the NFL draft the next year, the first pick, which was some guy named O.J. Simpson. Now, I'm not fond of other things he's done in his personal life, but on the football field, it sure would have been nice to have O.J. Simpson, Terry Bradshaw handed off to O.J. That would have been great. So, but they were futile. The Cincinnati Reds, up until the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, when a guy named Sparky Anderson joined the team as the manager, the Reds were, again, an exercise in futility. Very few wins, very few things to cheer about. Same thing for UK basketball, as I said earlier. When they were horrible, they were absolutely horrible. Cedar Park had its trials and errors before they had an opportunity to win that state championship. But when we did, when we rung that championship bell, it was as if I was on the field with them and was victorious with them. I don't know if you have a favorite sports team, and for those of you who aren't very fond of sports, I apologize that let's throw these hook'em signs over here. I'm not from here, so I'll tolerate it today. But simply because I'm in enemy territory, I want to make sure I get out of the church building alive. That's right. We are champions, whether it's our sports team, whether it's our what we do for a living. But I want to tell you that more than that, we are champions because of the victory that we have in Jesus Christ. Because of His victory over sin, His victory over death, and His willingness to share that victory with us. We are champions. Our story last week ended with Jesus being crucified on the cross, and the sky had turned black. The earth was shaking, and there they all stood. His disciples, His family, His friends, the Jews, the Romans, the crowd, all standing there watching Jesus. And as they gently took him off the cross, they laid him to rest in a tomb. They wrapped him and they laid him in the tomb. And nightfall came. Brokenheartedness was all around. Sorrow, grief, anger, bewilderment, disgust, shock, despair, dejection, defeat. This certainly didn't look like a victory. It certainly didn't feel like a victory. It didn't sound like a victory. And as we pointed out last week with the blood flowing all over Jerusalem, it didn't smell like a victory. It smelled like death. It smelled like defeat. There would be no victory for Jesus that day. But that day had been spoken about from the beginning of time. If you will, follow along with me. Let's turn over to Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, we have the mother of all prophecies. We have the beginning prophecy that will direct and guide everything that we read about in this Bible. Man has been tempted, mankind has been tempted, has succumbed to that temptation, and has fallen from the platform of sinless. And in their lost state, God comes to them in the garden and He confronts the serpent. And in verse 15, He says this, "You, O serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Enmity, ill will, hatred, strife. It implies warfare. And this book that we call the Bible is a book of warfare. As we're going to look time and time and time again, there's a warfare between the forces of evil and the forces of good. It's a warfare that's been laid out since the beginning of time, since before the beginning of the creations of the earth. God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are in heaven discussing what to do. And they say, as Paul tells us in Ephesians, God planned a plan. He purposed a plan. He said, I'm going to create humans. They're going to fall. We're going to have to redeem them. And Jesus raises his hand and says, I'll be the one that goes. I'll go do what needs to be done. And we read throughout Genesis, we read through the whole Old Testament story, we see that. And we see this seed line, this ancestry of Jesus, this posterity, this offspring. We see this time and time again played out. And we're left to question, it doesn't look like victory. As we're confronted time and time again with defeat. It doesn't look like victory. Cain and Abel. Cain rose up and slew his brother Abel. And so where's this seed line going to come from? It seemingly stopped right there at the beginning. It looks like Satan's victorious. Satan won in the first round. A TKO in the first round. He threw one punch and it's over. But God said, you know what? I'm going to give you another son, Adam. I'm going to give you another son, Eve. And you're going to name him Seth. And that seed line will be preserved through him. We fast forward a few chapters into Genesis and we see that in Genesis chapter 6, the righteous marry those who are unrighteous and wickedness ensues. And God brings a universal flood upon the earth and all flesh died. Every man. But God looked down, and one man named Noah found favor in God's sight. And again, the seed family is preserved. A few chapters later in Genesis chapter 17, there's a young lady named Sarah. And I say young, she's 89. The older I get, the younger old gets. Is that 89 years old, and she's married to a 99-year-old man. And God had promised them a son a long time before. And here she is, she's barren. She has passed the age of being able to bear children. And God, through the angels and the visitors that came, says, next year, this time, you'll be pregnant. And Sarah's off in the tent, and she starts laughing. She overhears the conversation, and she starts laughing. It looks like Satan has won again. This promised seed line of God has met its end because of the barrenness of a womb. But God will not allow a barren womb to destroy His plan. And so Isaac, laughter, is born the next year. And the seed line continues and the family continues. We read a little bit later in Genesis chapter 41 about the seed people, the Jews, those who have been pulled aside and set aside by God. They're doomed to starvation. But God, years before, had sent a young man named Joseph into Egypt. Oh, Joseph was a dreamer. Joseph had the heart of God, had the mind of God, was given dreams and would interpret them and knew what God wanted. And his brothers were so jealous of that. Now, I have to be considerate of his brothers because Joseph seemed like he was pretty high on himself there in the first part when we read that. And I'm not so sure that if I had a smart aleck brother like that, I wouldn't sell him off into slavery too. And we see over in Genesis chapter 50, Joseph addressing his brothers in his old age. He said, you meant it for evil when you sold me, but God meant it for good. He is preserving our family. What you meant to do to destroy me, God has built me up and preserved me. And so our family can now eat because of this grain abundance that we have here in Egypt. So God, once again, continues the seed line. God's purpose will not be defeated by a barren womb. It will not be defeated by a barren earth. And then there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And he looks around and he says, man, these Jews, they're pretty prolific. And if we don't watch out, they'll overtake all of us and we'll be slaves to them. So let's enslave them and make them work for everything that they've got. And let's not just make them work. Let's make them work and work and work. Oh, and let's not just make them work and work and work. Let's start killing their sons. Let's cut off that seed line. Let's destroy them as a people. But God preserved a baby in a basket in the Nile River, who we call Moses. He had drawn out of water. God drew his seed line out of water. And so once again, God has defeated Satan, and the seed line continues. Fast forward a number of years, and we find a young boy tending sheep. 16, maybe, tending sheep, and his brothers are in the army, and the army is quaking in their boots at the sight of a giant named Goliath, who comes out every day and smashes his armor and calls out, bring me your champion. Nobody from Israel will go. And so it looks like in that moment Israel is once again going to be cast into darkness and going to be defeated and be wiped out. And a young 16-year-old boy says, I'm right here. I'll go fight you. And he reaches in his pocket and he grabs out a stone and he slings it, hits the giant in the head, knocks him down, takes the giant's sword and cuts his head off. And Israel is once again preserved. It wasn't too many years later that King Saul would try to kill David time and time again. He's in there playing a harp and Saul would throw a spear at him at one time. But God saw the heart of David. God saw that in David there was a man who was pursuing my will. And man, you look at the life of David, it certainly doesn't look that way. His time with his killing Uriah, his rape of Bathsheba, his counting of his armies, his counting of the people, and time again, he disappoints God. I think maybe there's a message in there for all of us, even if we're not named David, that as long as our heart is pursuing God, He will preserve us. And in the end, He gives him Solomon. And the seed line continues. Hezekiah is terminally ill. It's the kingly line and the seed line. And he's sick, and he's to the point of death. And he doesn't have any male heirs. He doesn't have any male sons to carry on that line. God sends a prophet to him. And in that moment, he repents. When it looks like Satan has won again, God intervenes. Gives him 15 more years and gives him a son named Manasseh. And so the bloodline continues. Some years later, there's a man named Haman. We read about him over in Esther. Haman's envy and his pride looks like it's going to spell the end of the Jewish nation. Haman has the ear of the king. Oh, king, look at these Jews over here. We need to kill them. And the king says, well, let's make it happen. Haman, you're my number one advisor. I trust what you're saying. Let's do that. And the king can't sleep one night and goes back through the books and says, hey, there was somebody who saved my life here a while back. Whatever happened to that guy? Let's reward him. And in that, Esther has the ear of the king. And she says, Haman's trying to kill us all. And so God, through the voice, the soft, gentle voice of a young Jewish lady, preserves his people. And the seed line continues. Esther is the means by which God preserves his seed people. And we fast forward a number of years, and please don't misunderstand, there are story after story after story where it looks like Satan has won. It looks like they're at the end of the game, and there's 2 seconds left on the clock, and the other team has the ball, and they're going to take a knee, and it's over. But God, time and time again, continues that seed line. Christ is born, and Herod slaughters the infants 2 years old and under. We've seen that story before, haven't we? That's not new. Kings and their envy and their jealousy and their ignorance have been trying to kill since the beginning of time. But Christ is born. God came to Joseph in a dream. He says, you take that young boy of yours, and you take your wife, and you go to Egypt, and I'll preserve your life there. And so God's purpose cannot be defeated by a wicked king's plot. And we fast forward a little bit more into time, and we see, as we've studied in the past in our days in the life of Jesus, we see Jesus being tempted by Satan. Satan has gone a roundabout way from the beginning of time to try to end this. That prophecy way back in Genesis 3. He'll crush your head, but you'll strike his heel. You'll bruise his heel. And Satan, I'm thinking probably in his ignorance, thought he was the one who was going to do the crushing. In his vain, in his vanity, in his pride, in his envy. And so finally, after a couple of thousands of years of God manipulating and directing things, we arrive at the point where Satan, the serpent, gets to meet him face to face, gets to meet Jesus face to face. And he takes him up and he tempts him for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. And he takes him up on the highest hill, and he looks out over the kingdoms of the world, as we've talked about before, and he says, if you will bow down to me and worship me, I'll give you all this.